we have Chief Tatobem, right? Tatobem. So Chief Tatobem, he's the son of Wopig-Woo-It. So Wopig-Woo-It was the chief of the Pequot. He dies of the Long Island Pequot. And then after Wopig-Woo-It dies, Chief Tatobem becomes the new chief. So Tatobem is now chief of the Pequot. Now, Chief Tatobem had been trading with the Dutch. They had set this little, fort up, the Dutch did, to trade with the Native Americans. And so he goes to apparently to the Dutch ship or into the fort to trade, right? Because that's what the Dutch said that they were doing. And they just established themselves, 1633, the Fort of Good Hope, or the Hope Fort, Dutch, whatever it was, in Hartford, Connecticut. You know what I'm talking about, America. So I've seen it actually written down in several different dates, but I believe it's 1634. I saw several of them agree on that, but I've also seen 1622, 1632, and 1633. But you got a Dutch West Indian Company trader named Jacob Ellikins, and Jacob Ellikins, he's going to murder, he's going to assassinate the Pequot chief Tatobem. So Tatobem comes up and says, hey, I want to trade, you said you were going to trade, I got some beaver here, what do you got to trade? And he didn't have shit to trade, so Jacob Jacques Ellikin, being the fucking smart conquistador, Dutch conquistador that he is, just fucking kidnaps him, captures him, Tatobem, and he says to the Pequot, you need to go get me some money, go, for ransom. If you give me some money, I'll give you back your chief. And the Pequot's like, okay, shit, just calm down, Jacob, calm the fuck down. And so they went and got a whole bunch of wampum, 140 fathoms of wampum, bushels and bushels of wampum. Currency back then with the natives and with the European, wampum was, and so was chocolate, and so was vanilla beans, chocolate beans, and pecans. Pecans was, so food, right? Food would be currency back in the day, back in the 1600s. So they bought bushels of wampum. That was the currency back then. He wasn't happy with that. He kills Tatobem anyways. So this is how sick the fucking Dutch is. And the Mystic River Massacre is going to happen 3 years later, and none of the causes make any goddamn sense. This is one of the causes, right? So the fact that the Dutch just goes around assassinating the fucking leaders, right? It wasn't Tatobem killing Jacob Ellikins, it was the Dutch killing Chief Tatobem, and that's the Pequot. So you want to say that the assassination of the leader of the Pequot had nothing to do with the Mystic River Massacre and the Pequot War that's going to happen a year or two afterwards? Jacques Ellikins, he killed Tatobem anyways. It was near Hartford, Connecticut, the capital of the Pequot Village. So this is Pequot Village, Pequot Central, and the fucking Dutch set up this Fort Good Hope, and then they just kill Chief Tatobem just for the fuck of it. So after Tatobem was killed, Sassacus becomes the Pequot's main sachem, Chief Sassacus. And Sassacus is the last chief sachem of the Pequot, at least of the 1600s Pequot, because we got Pequot running around here today, which is a success story, and I hope to get to it today. So, but right now we're in 1634, the year of the table knife. 3 years before 1637, the Mystic Massacre, the Mystic River Massacre. So another thing that happened on 1634 that is used as an excuse for the Pequot War is the killing of John Stone. Well, who is John Stone? Who is this great American John? Happening the same year that the Dutch established a fort. Dutch established a fort. Now all of a sudden Tatobem is killed. John Stone is being killed. All this death, all this bloodshed. So the Dutch, it's a commercial venture. They just want to make a shit ton of money. And if they have to murder some Native Americans, that's not beyond the Dutch. They don't mind that. And so the Pequot and the Native Americans are very nervous about the Dutch, right? Rightfully so. And Captain John Stone is going to be killed. Now, Captain John Stone was a criminal. He was a pirate. He was a slave trader. He wanted to kidnap some of the Western Niantics and kidnap the men or kidnap the women and the children, or both, kidnap the men to take them to the village, to kidnap all the women and children and the men, and just make them all slaves, go down to Jamestown. They were trading in slaves and in Jamestown in 1630s. So John Stone wanted to make a quick buck, right? So John Two major events happened in 1634, and actually three major events. The Dutch established Fort Good Hope. So that's one major event. Tatobem gets killed by the leader of the Dutch West Indies Company, the WIC, and so that's huge, Jacob Elkins. And then John Stone gets killed, okay? So he stops at the mouth of the Connecticut River on the way to Virginia. He was going to capture some Western Niantics to sell them as slaves in Jamestown. So he captured two folks. This is John Winthrop's account. He captures two men, and he was taking the two men, by hostage, and also telling them, where's the village? Where's the rest of the people? Where's all your money? Take me to your leader so I could capture the whole village. Well, that puts those captured natives in a precarious situation. Well, eventually the Western Niantics follow John Stone and kill them in their sleep. 7 of his crew and John Stone gets killed by the Western Niantics. Stone was a piece of shit. John Stone deserved to die. John Stone was a criminal. John Stone was trying to kidnapping people and enslaving them. And also, the English didn't even like John Stone. He put a knife to William Bradford's neck. So he's threatening to kill the Plymouth governor with a knife. He's got legal troubles because he tried to hijack a ship. So he's a pirate, a drunkard, a lecher, a braggart, a bully, and a blasphemer is what the Puritans from Boston said. He's a slave trader from the West Indies. So apparently he had some connections in London, but the British, the English, didn't even like John Stone. He was a low-down, dirty, rotten scoundrel, and he was a fucking criminal. Slave trading, stealing people's boats. He was the elite, so he actually felt like he didn't have to abide by the laws or of, nature and humanity. He didn't have to abide by anybody's laws. There was no laws for... Stone was a businessman, and essentially he reaped what he sown. He tried to capture some Western Niantics to enslave them, and the Western Niantics killed him. So he deserved what he got. He deserved what he got. He had a shitty reputation, so he was a piece of shit anyways. He was trying to get a buck, trying to make $1. He was a businessman. And so when you come to America, what is there? If he doesn't have any trees or beaver pelts, well, hell, he's just going to kidnap people and sell the people. So, setting sail from Boston, he abducted, right? Okay, so I already said all this. John Mason said that the killers were not native Pequot. So that's another important point. Two huge important points. He's a private, he's a pirate, right? He was killed by the Western Niantics justly near the mouth of the Connecticut River. So that was just. That was okay. That was acceptable. And even if it wasn't acceptable, it wasn't the Pequot. It was the Western Niantics, an entirely different tribe. It was not the... John Stone deserved to die. He deserved to die. What he was doing with Western Niantics and them, just for the kidnapping, for stealing people's ships, for being a pirate, for being part of the slave trade itself. And then they said drunkenness, adultery, piracy, malfeasance. So this, basically, that's a long list. He's a piece of shit, and they condemned him, and they banished him, and they said, get the fuck out of here. And after they banished him and said, get the fuck out of here, instead of being, at first they were happy. There was indifference to outright joy in Boston. Hell yeah, that piece of shit John Stone got exactly what he deserved. But then the narrative started changing. And so instead of telling John Stone, get the fuck out, never ever come back unless you want to be put to death, because he was banished from the English colonies on the penalty of death. If John Stone returned to Boston, they would have killed him themselves. But once he got killed, John Stone was killed by the Western Niantics. Now, all of a sudden, oh my God, what a fine man John Stone was. He was one of us. His good name must be avenged. So Boston's Protestant clergy totally forgot about John Stone's many past transgressions and mounted their pulpits to condemn the Pequot as demons from hell. Oh my God, these Pequot are demons from hell. It wasn't even the Pequot, it doesn't matter. Who gives a shit? Why? Because they're a bunch of racists. So that's all it took, right? They didn't want the Pequot. They didn't want any of the Native Americans to survive. The Pequot were trading with the Dutch. They were probably pissed off at their nation being the most favored trading, most favored status, most favored nation trading status. And so they were pissed off at the Dutch trade with the Pequot. The Pequot were making money, getting guns, and getting beat. I just don't resonate with the elites. George Washington, while he was liberal for his time, the way he wore the powdered wigs and the breeches and just their different ways. He was a slave-owning piece of shit, And then the Pilgrims, these were elites. So let's assume we were having a colony to the moon. Who would be the people that would go? It wouldn't be me. It wouldn't be regular folks. It would be the wealthy, the rich, the powerful, the connected. They would be the ones who, if there were any adventure-minded folks that wanted to go to the moon, and then they would bring along the people that they needed, right? So the scientists and the engineers and the they would get all the people. So you'd have to have a skill, right? If a person like me wanted to go to a colony mission to the moon, then I'd have to develop a skill that they would that they would need, because they couldn't do it themselves. And so I don't resonate with the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims are not me, especially 1600s. They didn't even use table knives. Savages. Sit there and try to tell me that the Pequot, I don't know what the Pequot did. I don't know what the Pequot did. Eventually they're going to fight back. But eventually, you assassinated their fucking leader, right? And then the thing with John Stone was, apparently they said that they thought John Stone was Dutch and they didn't realize, but it doesn't fucking matter. None of that even matters. He was a criminal. He was a criminal that even the English colonies wanted to put to death if he was to return. So he's like, oh shit. So he's desperate and, right, tries to kidnap some Native Americans, and then the Native Americans that he kidnapped killed him. So, c'est la vie, good fucking riddance. So that's bullshit. That doesn't make any goddamn sense whatsoever. They had a right to defend themselves. The Western Niantics did, and it had nothing to do with the Pequot. So the Dutch is assassinating the leaders of the Pequot. John Stone got killed by the Western Niantics. So far, the Pequot are just victims. What the fuck did the Pequot do to deserve a genocide? The Pequot War almost virtually said there were some survivors of the Pequot, but they held on by a thread. They hung on by a thread. So Jacques Ellikins, he didn't have anything to sell. He wasn't setting up a farming community. He wasn't setting up civilization. He didn't fight and earn anything from his own labor and his, the sweat of his own brow. Instead, he just wanted to steal the Pequot and Tatobem's labor. He just got, tired of Tatobem coming up and saying, hey, what do you got to trade? Well, I had nothing to trade. So Jacques Ellikins, the fucking Dutch, this is a multinational corporation which has the power of the state behind it. So this is the Dutch West Indies, the WIC company. And the Dutch didn't give a fuck about Tatobem. There were no trials. There was no accusations. No warrants were issued against Jacques Ellikins' arrest. For Tatobem, there was no justice. The only thing that happened was they exchanged Jacques Ellikins for somebody else so they could resume trade. So he, I guess, was demoted. But the Dutch was the House of Good Hope, but it was also a fort and a factory, and it was a trading center. So Fort Good Hope, I think, is a good little name. And it was built at present-day Hartford, Connecticut. So where the capital of the state of Connecticut is sitting today is where the Dutch had a trading post called Fort Good Hope. And this happened in 1634, the same year that the Dutch kills the chief of the Pequot, Tatobem, and the same year that the Western Niantics killed John Stone. Now, the Pequot's still going to try to be nice. They're still, reaching out. And they had sent several peace emissaries to the people. 1634 is also when John Oldham, Old Ham, and he's known as Mad Jack. So Mad Jack, he moves into Wethersfield, which is a few miles south of Fort Good Hope. A few miles south. So it's almost like when Starbucks opens right across from one another, or a bank. It's like, what the hell y'all doing? You're going to build the fort just a few miles south? And I think there's also a fort that's a few miles north. John Winthrop describes a Pequot attempt to make peace in the following letter to Plymouth Plantation, they being now at war with the Dutch and the rest of their neighbors. So he says the Pequot's trying to make peace because they're at war with the Dutch and all their neighbors and everybody else. October 23rd, 1634, the Pequot sent a messenger bearing gifts and promises of tribute to Roger Ludlow, the deputy governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Pequot sent in tribute, right? The Dutch just assassinated their leader, so now they're saying, look, English, let's, and then John Stone was killed by the Western Niantics. Everybody's freaking out. November 7th, 1634, the Second Pequot Embassy, the Massachusetts Bay Company / Pequot Treaty. The Pequot negotiators, there was some communication. They thought that they were going to get Stone's murderers, and then they were going to get some pounds, 250 pounds sterling in wampum, and then they were going to cede Connecticut lands to trade with the English. So they were going to give them some lands, and the disputes with the Narragansetts would be mediated by the English. Looks like it was a pretty complicated document. They get some of the Pequot they didn't actually sign on to it. The Pequot Council would not ratify the treaty. They objected to the Stone's murderers. It was the Western Niantics. They said they were either all dead or beyond their reach. So we can't hand the killers over. We can't hand the killers over. We had nothing to do with it. It would be like, going into Boston and saying, hey, there was some killer in Naples, Florida, and you need to give us the killer or else we're going to punish you. It makes no sense. The Western Niantics killed John Stone, so it doesn't even make any sense. John Winthrop, is sitting there writing all this stuff down, so he's Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's also the one who establishes Fort Saybrook at the mouth of the Connecticut River in 1635. So then the Dutch actually make good with the Pequot. They got Peter Berenson, who spoke Algonquin, to replace Jacob Ellikins. Pequot just had their main chief assassinated by the Dutch, and now John Stone, they're being blamed for John Stone's death, even though they had nothing to do with it. They give gifts and promises of tribute to Roger Ludlow. They have this meeting. They have a treaty. Apparently, Massachusetts Bay and the Pequot have a treaty, but the leadership had signed it, but the Pequot Council was against it. And it's also talking about them having to pay some money, some kind of ransom. So there's some things here that has to do with John Stone, which makes no sense, but the disputes with the Narragansett, the English wanted to basically mediate the disputes that the Pequot would have with the Narragansetts. So they want to kind of establish law and then the lands. So there was a land deal, and then there was a legal aspect to the treaty that seems like it's makes more sense to me. The thing with John Stone, again, it wasn't the Pequot, the Western Niantic. 1634, we see that John Oldham and a handful of Massachusetts families build temporary houses in the area of Wethersfield. So that's going to be one of the three main Connecticut cities. So that happens in 1634. You got the English building, shit. You had in Connecticut, so John Oldham is coming in. You got the Dutch coming in with Fort Good Hope. You have Tatobem, who is killed. This is all 1634. 1634 is a huge year. Tatobem is going to get killed by the Dutch West Indies trader, and then the Dutch is going to replace Jacob Ellikins with Peter Berenson. Because of it, Peter Berenson speaks Algonquins, trusted by the Pequot. After a suitable round of apologies and gifts, they resume trade. John Winthrop builds Fort Saybrook in 1635, the next year, and then John Stone gets killed, right? So 1634, John Stone gets killed, Tatobem gets killed, John Oldham establishes Wethersfield, the Dutch establish Fort Good Hope. They get a new guy in there, Peter Berenson, and then over the next 2 years, the Oldhams, you have 30 families come from Watertown, Massachusetts to follow John Oldham into Wethersfield. So John Winthrop's Massachusetts Bay Colony's got Fort Saybrook at the mouth of the Connecticut River, and then John Oldham is bringing Massachusetts families also into Wethersfield. So it was first a handful. Over the next 2 years, 30 more families are coming from Watertown, Massachusetts to Wethersfield, Connecticut, which is a few miles south of Fort Good Hope. And Fort Saybrook is at the mouth of the Connecticut River too, so it's almost like they're building right at the same spot. Read some facts because I'm a nerd like that. So the Algonquin Lenape population around the New York Bay and along the lower Hudson were seasonally migrational people. The Dutch called the numerous tribes collectively the River Indians, all the ones around the Hudson Bay and the Hudson River, the lower Hudson, New York Bay. The River Indians were known by their exonyms, such as the Wequasgeek, the Hackensack, the Raritan, the Canarsie, and the Tappan. The Wequasgeek, the Wequasgeek, Hackensack, the Raritan, the Canarsie, and Tappan. These groups had the most frequent contact with the New Netherlanders. The Munsee inhabited the highlands, Hudson Valley, and northern New Jersey, while the Minquas, called the Susquehannocks by the English, lived west of the Zud River, Zud Riviere, along and beyond the Susquehanna River. Munsee, the Minnequas, the Minquas, Susquehannocks, Tappan, Canarsie, Raritan, Hackensack. I like the Hackensacks. And then the Wecquaesgeek. And what else? Oh, and the Dutch and the English. The smallpox epidemic of 1616 to 19 killed a bunch of Native Americans, but not our Native Americans in New England, present-day New England. But the Pequot and the Niantics and the Narragansett tribes, all of them did not get the disease. So none of them got smallpox in that first epidemic in the late 1610s. 1926, Peter Minuit becomes the director of New Netherland, and he makes one of the most legendary real estate deals ever. That's the $24 for all Manhattan, the Delaware, the Lenape, the Algonquin natives with Peter Minuit, the Dutch. In 1626, I want to mention quickly about the Mohawk-Mohican War. Apparently, Mohegan and Mohican are two different tribes, but they're very close. So I wouldn't, they could be connected. So the Mohawk-Mohican War happened from 1624 to 1628. The Mohawk couldn't directly trade with the French in New France or the Dutch in New Amsterdam and probably the Swedes in New Sweden. So the Mohawk attacked the Mohicans so they could get the direct trade route. And the Pequot were the main trading partners of favored nation status with the Dutch. The French were with the Mohawk, so it seems weird just for trade. They would kill people just for trade. It makes more sense that the Dutch or the French or the English would send these Native Americans, you know, as sort of paid mercenary terrorists to wreak havoc upon their smallpox epidemic 1616 to 1619. 1626, Peter Minuit buys Manhattan for $24. That fucking myth. It's not totally far away from it though. The Mohawk-Mohican War was right in the middle of it, 1624 to 1628. So Peter Minuit is buying from the Lenape. And so just the Mohegans, the Pequot, where the Mohicans, they go this way. So this is the 1620. So I'm just giving you some of the background before the 1630s. And then 1633, September 1633 is when Fort Good Hope is established, or June 8th. June 8th, 1633, the Dutch West India Company establishes Fort Good Hope. So in the middle of 1633, there's a Dutch fort, and then massacre. They're saying in 1633 there's going to be another epidemic that devastates the region's native population, and the historians say that Pequot suffer the loss of 80% of their population. So not only is the leader of the Pequot going to get assassinated, but 80% of their population is dying of these weird-ass diseases. These weird-ass people are colonizing, and people are dying of weird-ass diseases. And then who's to say that they weren't passing out smallpox blankets in 1633? They were known to do it. I haven't heard any evidence of the Dutch actually doing it, but it was done. And it was smart, right? Biological warfare. So a trading post in the 1600s, the Dutch colony of New Netherland, they set up Fort Good Hope in modern-day Hartford, Connecticut, in the middle of 1633, 1634. And then that's when you have Tatobem gets killed, John Stone gets killed, you have John Oldham. 1633, English settlers from other New England colonies were moving into the Connecticut Valley, 1630s. In 1633, William Holmes led a group of settlers from Plymouth Colony to Connecticut Valley, where they established Windsor a few miles north of the Dutch trading post. So William Holmes is established in Windsor above Fort Good Hope, and then you have John Oldham established in Weathersfield, a few miles south of Fort Good Hope. They're all just piling on top of one another. Maybe that was, eventually the Dutch and the English are going to fight, and then 1650s New Amsterdam is going to become New York. But in the 1630s, they're just more competition instead of like their sovereignty was being threatened. I don't know if there was any skirmishes or battles between the Dutch and the English before the 1630s. Wethersfield, they brag about themselves being the most ancient town in all of America, but really you have to ignore all the Native American towns. You have to ignore Cahokia. You got to ignore the Fort Good Hope, and even the other, the most ancient town in Connecticut is Wethersfield. Can that be true? John Oldham, founded Wethersfield in 1634, and then in 1633, William Holmes led a group of settlers from Plymouth Colony to the Connecticut Valley, where they established Windsor a few miles north of the Dutch trading post. So it sounds like Windsor is older than Wethersfield. So them being the most ancient town in Connecticut, I call bullshit on that. They were established 1634, Wethersfield was, and then Tatobem gets killed in 1634, John Stone gets killed 1634. The Dutch needed the Algonquin and the Iroquois in order to capture and skin the beavers. They didn't know how to do that shit, so they were dependent on the Pequot and the other Algonquin and the Iroquois. The Dutch were dependent, so actually all the English and the Dutch were dependent on them to do the work, to capture the stuff, and then the Dutch and the English had to pay for it in some way. What do you find valuable? But I think it's John Stone, his death was not an excuse to go to war. And Thanksgiving as a whole, in order to commemorate a whitewashed moment where Caucasians gleaned over the genocide of 10 to 100 million American natives to perpetuate a facade and unholy Christian veneer, we as a society celebrate mass murder with an annual mass murder of turkeys. 46 million turkeys are killed every year for American Thanksgiving. So take a big old bite of that, America. That's not turkey you're eating, that's Pequot, Shawnee, Lenape, Matabasic, Huron,